In the 1920s, due to the changes that were taking place economically and the rise of the consumer culture, there was also a profound change in the popular culture. Now, what's going on in popular culture in the 1920s? Well, the movie industry is going to make a series of artistic and technical breakthroughs. That's going to be the talkies, and later on there's going to be color that will be invented. During this time, we will see very ostentatious, well-appointed movie theaters open up where individuals could watch the new Hollywood stars, this new popular culture focused around celebrity, the culture of celebrity. With the Great Migration, jazz music will come into vogue. This is a rhythmic music derived as part of African American culture, that during the Great Migration they're going to bring this artistic endeavor with them. And we can see here in popular culture Wall Street, just what exactly is on the minds of Americans during the 1920s. This is a powerful, all-talking drama about the Napoleon of finance, who forces himself only to be ruined, humbled, and then regenerated by a woman who had ideals. Now, insofar as popular culture, phonograph is going to be this invention that can play recorded music. Jazz is going to be able to be spread all the more effectively as this new form that is quintessentially and uniquely American. And radio. Radio is going to promote an interest in baseball, boxing, and college football. Now, before 1865, the only American sport really that there was lacrosse, and no one really had much leisure time to play any type of sports activities. During the Civil War, we're going to see an increase in baseball teams that are put together by military units, and then that's going to maintain the interest in baseball. The heavyweight champion of the world for the majority of the 1920s, boxing is going to be very popular. People are going to be listening to the boxing matches on the radio. Sports becomes a form of social lubricant. There is a concern growing in the economy that because so many of the jobs are now based on office work, that men were going to lose their masculinity, sans some sort of way to train their body. Before, men were doing heavy industrial jobs or working in the agricultural fields, and so they had a chance to be physically fit through the work that they were doing with their hands. That's starting to change in the 1920s, and with that rise of office work, there's the idea that perhaps we need to also give men an outlet for competition. And so the first leagues that will be organized and eventually become Major League Baseball are going to be outfits that were established through businesses and sponsored by businesses. The same is going to hold true with football when it eventually does become professional. College football is the dominant form of the sport right now. Jack Dempsey is going to be the heavyweight champion of the world, 1919 to 1927. Women's roles were changing because they were now needed to consume in this new economy that was being formed in the 1920s. And it's very ironic that as women began to win politically, gaining the right to vote and being successful in passing of prohibition, their political victory started to slow down once they had achieved their progressive aims. We see the formation of the National Woman's Party under Alice Paul, and that's going to promote women's rights to vote and share political and economic equality. There was an Equal Rights Amendment that was proposed, meant to eliminate all legal distinctions between the sexes. But within the women's rights movement, they were split in regards to the Equal Rights Amendment, because due to the progressive era, there was a series of laws that were put in place to protect women specifically. And there was a real concern that if women did sign on for the Equal Rights Amendment that was being pushed by the NWP, all of those rights that were hard fought for and achieved during the progressive era might be null and void. The Equal Rights Amendment would go down to defeat, and to this day the Equal Rights Amendment has not been passed. Now, the new woman was much more confident in her sexuality and in her own body and independence. And this is a flapper. These are women from the period who wore very short skirts and cut off their hair and smoked cigarettes and danced to jazz music in the speakeasies of the 1920s. She wore makeup, which was something that was never done before. The only women who wore makeup before the 1920s were, for the most part, women of the night. And so while in the 1920s there weren't any major political victories that were won by women, they did win a great deal of space for themselves, new, unique space within the public sphere and within society and culture. Now, many Americans were uncomfortable with the liberal mores of the youth culture and the erosion of community life. Some people found hope in Protestant fundamentalism. Now, there were several religious splits in the United States in the 1920s. There was the tension between the newly arrived immigrants that were mostly Catholic and the Protestant Protestants who had been established in the country. And then there's a divide between modernists and fundamentalists. Modernists are Protestants who sought to adapt their faith to the findings of scientific theories. Fundamentalists had a completely different opinion. They were Protestants who insisted that the Bible should be understood as God's revealed word and asserted and upheld the main points of traditional Christian doctrine. Now, these religious divisions will come to a head during the Scopes monkey trial, a court case that revolved around a state school that prohibits the teaching of evolution. John Scopes offered to break the law to test its constitutionality, and he will be defended by a new organization that's founded in the 1920s, the American Civil Liberties Union. And this was the first trial to be broadcast on live radio. And what's going on with immigration restriction and quotas? There was a concern, especially during World War I, whether the United States was going to tear itself apart based on divided loyalties of immigrants and individuals and groups that made up the tapestry that was of the American population. So we start to see immigration restriction and quotas. Americanization. This is the notion that immigrants should leave behind their old ways and melt into the Anglo-Saxon mainstream. And these Anglo-Saxon Protestants who had been here believed that that wasn't happening enough. And that's some of the motivations that we see behind prohibition. Then there's also this other concept that was known as the melting pot, that all nations' peoples contributed their cultural traits to a single mix, creating something new. But we have the National Origins Act in May 1926, which is going to put severe restrictions on immigration. Now, if we follow the graph, we can see that because of World War I, naturally immigration was going to be very low, but it stayed low and bottomed out all throughout the period. But immigration to the United States bottomed out in 1940. Throughout this entire period, there was a restriction on immigration. The concept that the new immigrants were not becoming Americanized enough, there needed to be a break on immigration so that the groups that had come to the United States had a chance to adopt more of the cultural mores and sensibilities of America to a greater extent. And it will take until after World War II before we start to see immigration numbers start to rise once more. And because of the changing cultural mores and sensibilities of the period, there is a reaction. And so during the 1920s, we see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan once more, this paramilitary organization that was formed to redeem the South after Reconstruction. And the Ku Klux Klan can best be interpreted as a reaction. I'll take, for example, the Ku Klux Klan when it was reorganized in the 1920s was anti-black, it was anti-immigrant, and it was anti-Catholic. So it added to its hate platform. And this social undercurrent naturally played a role in the immigration quotas. So by the election of 1928, we see many of the tensions and anxieties of this period coming to a head. The Democrats are going to run a Catholic Irishman for their nomination, which is going to be a big deal. Al Smith will be the first Irish-American and non-Protestant to run and win a nomination from one of the major parties. He's going to run against Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was a businessman, a self-made man. He was a cabinet secretary in the Harding administration and stayed on with Calvin Coolidge after Harding died of a heart attack in 1923. And America is going to continue with the pro-business Republicans of Harding and then Calvin Coolidge, and now tapping Herbert Hoover. And prohibition is going to be the major dividing issue of the election of 1928. And in the election of 1928, women did show their political power once more at the end of the period. Herbert Hoover is going to win the election of 1928. Al Smith is going to win his state of Massachusetts, and he's going to carry the South. But Herbert Hoover overall, just like Republicans of this time period, is going to dominate the Electoral College, and he's going to win the election. And America's confidence in itself appears to be at an all-time high in 1928. And then we start to see some structural changes that forebode choppy waters ahead for the American people. In 1929, the stock market crashes. It was lowering since September 4th, and then finally the prices bottomed out on the 23rd of October. The 29th would see the largest single day drop ever, and the market lost almost 37% of its value. By 1933, it lost 85% of its volume. Billions are going to be lost as stocks crash, and it's going to usher in our next subject, which is the Great Depression.